for today. Dr. Yo Jackson is the Associate Director of the University of Kansas Child and Family Services Clinic, and she has some great information to share with you today. So now at this time, I will be turning the presentation over to her, so bear with us for a moment while we change screens.
Actually, Christy, you have the PowerPoint.
Okay, I will run it from over here. I did want to mention one more thing. Dr. Jackson has asked for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type in your questions at any time and we'll be monitoring those, and then we will make sure that your question does get asked as time allows. So just enter your question as you think of them and we will get them answered at the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be talking with you today about this important topic, one that is of interest to lots of folks across a lot of different disciplines, and it's great to see a wide range of folks represented this morning. I'm going to start by just giving you an outline of what we're going to talk about today to give you some information on the nature of stress and trauma in youth across a pretty wide age range. We'll also talk about the resiliency process. We'll also talk about factors that can contribute to positive outcomes, so things that are identified as potential protective factors. And then I'm also going to give you a very recent example of a model of resilience, so you can see all the pieces together, how the risk factors as well as the potential protective factors work as we think, in concert to produce good outcomes for kids. This last example I'm going to give you is going to be one specific to kids exposed to child maltreatment. So we're going to start with a definition, or a couple of definitions, because terms like stress and trauma are not restricted to the domain of academics. They're terms that are used commonly in popular culture. So just so that we're all on the same page, I'm going to give you the definition, the working definition we'll be using for this talk today. Sometimes folks refer to stress as life events, so you might hear me use those phrases somewhat interchangeably. But as we think about stress, I think the simplest way to conceive of it is the notion that children have challenges in their lives, or what we call manageable stressors. And those are important for children to be able to grow. It's critical that children have some experiences that challenge their ability to function on a level that is what we call reasonable or manageable. These are important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that it provides a child an opportunity to demonstrate their mastery and their ability and to grow in their understanding of how the world works. Specifically, having stress as a child allows the child to address three important questions. The first question is, who or what can I count on? When things happen in my life, what things are stable, what things are not stable, and who are the important people or resources or agencies or systems that I can go to when I need help. The second question is, what can I do? Children learn from experience about what their skills are, what their talents are, and the same is true as it relates to stressors in their life. As threats come their way, as is the nature of life, they learn early and on a small scale what abilities they can bring to bear. There really is no better school for learning what you can do than actually having to face it. So having children who get an experience with some stress, and I say some stress, right, we'll talk about what levels in a moment, is important for them to establish that sense of control and power and sense of self. Lastly, the question of can I be okay, even when things don't work out the way that I want, is an important question for children to address. Even though things don't go my way, and we know that that happens in life and it happens to everyone, can I still be all right? Will I be okay if things don't turn out just the way that I expect? So we start with this because it's important to remember that children who have experiences in life that test them or challenge them, that those are important steps. And then, although hard to witness as caretakers from time to time, watching them struggle, it is important that they have some experiences which they can grow from. It's really quite an important balance that children have to strike. And as care providers for children and as frontline folks who work with kids who have challenges, I'm sure it's clear to you from your experience that having some experiences with stress allows some children to grow. So they need just enough to test them and hone their skills and their resources. However, there are some caveats with those experiences, right? There are some things we have to bear in mind. Like, for example, those stressors or those life events, in order for them to serve a positive purpose, need to be time limited. They also need to be spaced out so that there's some time for the child to recover from those experiences. So what we know is that children may have a stressor or a life event that's particularly challenging for them, but given a reasonable amount of time or a sufficient amount of time for them to react and to seek out resources, then they're able to recover from those things. They're allowed space to do that. It's difficult when they don't have that space. It's important to bear in mind really an underlying theme here, which is that no stress in childhood is really not a good idea. Although we would like to protect children as much as possible, too much protection, where children don't get an opportunity to be challenged, leads to insecurity in children. It's very interesting because what we notice is that kids who are overly protected tend to behave in the same maladjusted ways as children who have too much stress. So it really goes both ways. It's sort of the example of two extremes, right? So if you have too little stress or too much protection, we see problems and potential for pathology. And if you have too much stress and not enough protection, then we also see similar kinds of pathologies. So the question becomes ultimately, where is that balance? And what we'll note is there are some themes for some kids. We've learned a few things about what works best in general, but it is important to remember that every child is different, and we'd want to tailor our reactions to their unique needs. So as we think about stress, another phrase or term that comes up, often used interchangeably, perhaps unfortunately, is this notion of trauma. Trauma, in and of itself, more perhaps simple definition, relates to environmental conditions, by and large, that either interfere with your ability or threaten your ability to accomplish age-appropriate developmental tasks. It is important to also bear in mind that trauma is not exactly an event, meaning that we often, and I'm going to show you in a moment a list of the most commonly identified potential traumas that children can experience, but it's important to bear in mind that it's not really the event itself necessarily that makes it traumatic. Specifically, one of the things we have to consider is how the child was functioning before the event occurred. One of the best predictors of future abilities and future behaviors is your past developmental history. So what we know is that for children who are on a trajectory where they are lagging in their development or slow in their development or are behind in any way, events that occur typically have a greater impact on their functioning than, say, a child who was doing okay, had friends, was doing fairly well at school, had reasonable family relationships, and then something happened. They experienced something out of the ordinary. That child who's doing okay before stands a much greater chance of recovering from the very same event than another child might experience who is not progressing as expected. So I'm going to show you a list here. It's a sample list, bearing in mind that these are the kinds of things that we have identified historically as potentially traumatic. And you'll notice I've broken it up in a couple of different places, a couple of different descriptors. The research will talk about events that are acute versus events that are chronic, and events that are controllable and events that are uncontrollable from the child's perspective. So what you see there on the slide is some examples, surely not a comprehensive list, but some examples of the kinds of extraordinary events that can happen in a child's life that have a stop and a start, usually. Those are those acute events. Chronic events, which don't have a stop and a start and can actually be generational. Controllable events, things that children have some say in whether or not they occur, maybe not total control at times, but surely participate in whether or not those events occur. And uncontrollable events, usually things that parents are doing that have a significant impact on the child's functioning. So that said, and with my early warning that there really is not a list that we want to be too attached to, given that it really matters who the child is and how they were doing, let's take a little closer look at what makes an event actually traumatic, moving it from, say, a life event or a stress event that might be reasonable and expected to something that is, quote, traumatic or a trauma for the child. There's a couple of things that we might want to think about. Typically, events that lean towards the more traumatic or negative side or greatest potential for having negative impacts on children are events that are unexpected. So, for example, in the news recently, we heard about the terrible devastation in the South where tornadoes and storms ended up creating a tremendous amount of loss and a tremendous amount of loss of life. Those kinds of events, and you might even think back to Hurricane Katrina or other natural disasters that occur where you don't expect them to occur. You have no real sense that they will be on that scale. You might have some sense that tornadoes happen as a child, but not a sense that they necessarily will happen to you or that they will be as severe. In that vein, we also note that events that tend to be traumatic are those that also are expected to happen but are more severe than expected. So what we're noticing now, for example, is that children, particularly girls, are entering puberty at younger and younger ages with greater and greater negative effects. So that we expect, of course, children to transition physiologically, but we don't expect it to be as early, and we don't expect the symptoms to be quite as great as we're noticing. Other things like uncontrollable events, but one event that you can't do anything about. So, for example, accidents that happen to children. These are not mutually exclusive categories, by the way. There surely are natural disasters that are uncontrollable and that you can't do anything about. So understand that the same event could fall under several of these descriptors. Uncontrollable events, but when children try to do something about it, oftentimes moves those events even further into the trauma category. So, for example, children who live in homes where there's lots of parental conflict. Chronic events, when they are expected to have an end. So things like illness, when you have an infection or a disease where there should be a time when it's over, but in fact it keeps coming back, also contributes to this sense of it being traumatic. Now, we have a sense perhaps of qualifiers of what makes things traumatic, but that's surely not the entire story. It's not just the event that occurs, but also what happens with the event that I really want to stress. So what you see on the slide are some examples of the kinds of things that often co-occur with any kind of event that tends to make it worse, or if you will, make it more likely to be traumatic or more likely to lead to negative events for the child. So when you have an event that occurs where the support system diminishes, so for example, when you have a natural disaster or you have some trauma that affects the entire family, children are affected surely, but then you find that their caretakers are also in the moment and perhaps for some days or months and years later also diminished in their ability to be available for that child. So what would be a fairly even typical event, like say moving to a new home, if that becomes something where the parents can no longer afford the home, or it looks like the economy is now creating a greater stressor for the parent, the child's ability to adjust to that perhaps typical event may be diminished because they have fewer grown-ups in their lives who can be present for them. Other qualifiers we might want to bear in mind are stressors that really, if you will, begat other stressors. So anything that by its nature has the potential to create more stress in the child's routine, or any kind of event that upsets the child's routine. So the example that I put on the slide is physical abuse. When physical abuse is substantiated, the plan is for the child then to be placed in a safer environment, and that is often a foster placement. Although originally identified as an alternative that's better, we know, too, from the research that children who are placed in foster care suffer from a new set of stressors from the ameliorative foster care that they were experiencing. So there's new problems that come with being moved, even though that new placement is meant to be a help. Lastly, modeling by caretakers that the child is not okay is sometimes a rather subtle but important co-occurring factor with a lot of events that children experience. If parents or caretakers give the child the impression that things are terrible, things are devastating, and things are not okay, the child very quickly absorbs that feedback and will follow suit. So what do we notice about a child's reaction to trauma? I think it's important to also consider that there is no one sign that a child has experienced trauma. You cannot tell by looking, I think is the short way of saying that. You can't simply identify children by their behavior and say there must have been some sort of trauma. In fact, it's a bit more complicated than that. One fairly straightforward early identifier for children who are exposed to trauma events is a failure or a slowing of their ability to hit developmental milestones at the expected age. Other kinds of things that we see, other pathologies we see in kids exposed to trauma are things like anxiety, both the separation kinds of anxiety where they have difficulty being alone, as well as a more generalized sense of anxiety, this sort of sense of foreboding that something is going to happen, feeling threatened when there's really nothing around them that's threatening them. They're almost hyper alert or, on watch for new threats. Attachment problems are also a concern, that children, that their relationships oftentimes get severed or diminished as a result of trauma, and as a result makes it difficult for them to form positive bonds with new people. Depression and low self-esteem is another example of the kinds of things we see. Aggression, so on the other end of the continuum, we see kids who are also likely to act out, be non-compliant, perhaps be violent, and also poor boundaries, have a difficult time understanding what things they're in charge of and which things they're not in charge of. It's a very important lesson as a child moving through the developmental milestones, that you understand the areas where you have some power and areas where you don't. And children exposed to trauma oftentimes get this sense of control becomes very confusing for them because things happened that were unexpected or people didn't manage well, and as a result there's not a real sense of someone being in charge. So understanding resilience, in order to understand resilience, it's important that we walk through the risk and get a better sense of the layers and complexity of risk, because it is really at the heart of the definition of resilience. So a good, I think, also straightforward definition of resilience is a pattern of positive adaptation in the context of past or present adversity. There's a couple of key components of this definition. First, this is not a group of what we call super kids. You may have read or seen examples in the news of kids who are 13 and go to college, or children who have fantastic abilities way beyond what you might expect. Those are not the kids we're talking about. That's not really resilience in its truest sense. Resilience is really, in order to have resilience, you have to have some sort of risk or adversity in your life. It is not the case that we're really talking about kids who go above and beyond their developmental expectations. In fact, what these kids do is they hit their developmental expectations even though they have really no reason to, if you will, given that they've been exposed to a serious trauma. Now, in regular life, with typical stressors, and we'll use that word again, typical stressors are those things that are challenging but expected. Kids are resilient all the time. Kids face going to new schools or a new baby brother or going to summer camp, and although at the beginning all of those kinds of things may seem threatening or a challenge, many children are able to keep friends and have positive relations with their family and have good school performance. So there is some truth to the notion that kids can recover. But bear in mind, it's really only under situations where they have sufficient resources to do that, and if the event itself doesn't come with a bunch of new stressors or where the support goes away for their ability to manage it. Let me expand this definition just a little bit, because most of what folks are really interested in are kids who follow this positive adaptation, but yet are experiencing extraordinary environmental conditions. So really back more to the slide of the list of things like maltreatment or violence in the family or surgeries or disasters. That's really where most of the interest is when you have kids who grow up in environments where there's lots of violence, where there's not much support, and where there's lots of extra stressors that come with it, how are they able then to go to school? How are they able then to have friends, and why are they not developing more pathology? So I think that's where most of our interest is, and really being able to identify how they're able to do this across multiple life domains. So in the sense that this is a pattern, it's important to remember that we're really talking about kids who don't just do well in school despite the threats. They actually do well with peers, and their physical health is good. So that's important to bear in mind, that we're not talking about one area of life where they excel. In order to fit the definition of really being resilient, we're talking about children who maintain their expected developmental milestones across multiple domains of life. This is not a new concept by any means, although a fascinating one, not new by any means. What you're looking at now is probably a story you're very familiar with. Originally written back in the 1940s, this is the original cover from a children's story called The Little Engine That Could. And I have a feeling that all of you have some sense of exactly how this story ends, that there's a train that has stressors and challenges that the train has to try to overcome, and through a variety of resources that the train employs, including some other trains and some social support and some internal talking to themselves in the sense of I think I can, the train is able to make it across the big hill and carry the heavy load. So this is something I think we've been trying to talk to children about for a very long time. The bigger question perhaps is really, how does this happen? How does this ever happen? Bearing in mind we're thinking about those extraordinary events, this is a fairly new concept for social science. So despite the fact that we've looked at it as a children's story for quite a while, the real impetus for this work has really only come in the last 50 years. And it really comes from two sources. One is the clear and consistent indicators that we see that youth in our society are experiencing greater and more frequent risk, that what children are facing today is very different than a generation ago, and that the kinds of things they're experiencing are often more frequent, more severe, and difficult oftentimes to control. The second place that we see the impetus for this work is the increasing interest on how research on risk and protection can be clinically relevant, meaning we are learning that actually to intervene with children in a therapeutic situation, or even in a daycare situation, or in a day-to-day parent-child situation, that it can be relevant if we understand how risk and protection work together to just be better parents for children. So what does the research tell us? And I'm going to just speak very briefly about what we've learned, and then I'm going to show you some pictures of how we think it all works together. So the question has been twofold. Not only what poses a risk, right, what the risk factors are, and what's protective, but how do those things work together? You really don't have to study very much to probably guess at what risk factors are for children, and you probably all have your own theories, just from life experience, about what protection is and what really makes a difference for kids. But what you'll probably find if you ever got in a large group and all shared your stories is that everyone typically has a slightly different theory of what was protective or what made a difference for them. The primary research efforts have focused on the longitudinal study. So instead of a case-by-case example, which we all have, the research has taken our case-by-case examples and put them all together in a rather rigorous way. And that is the longitudinal study, where you follow kids over time. This is quite significant work. And the good news is that we can benefit now from the results of this work. We don't have to start from scratch, essentially. So what have we learned? Well, since about 1955, we have data on over about 17,000 kids, starting from the ages of birth all the way to 12, and following those kids up until they're about 40. That's pretty tremendous. That's a lot of work, and we owe a great debt, gratitude for the researchers who put the time in to collect this information. To give you a flavor of the kinds of things that folks have researched as trauma, if you will, or as stressors, what you see on the slide are some examples of the focus of that work. So things, really significant things, right, like poverty or abuse or divorce. Those have really been the primary areas of research. Substance abuse and also parental illness I just want to mention because it is often the, it was the original area of interest for this work. So just to give you a quick view, a snapshot of the work that's been done, here's some names of studies that have been done in the U.S. that have been following kids for decades. Both kids at risk and then kids with little to no risk as a comparison. This is not a domain that is restricted just to the United States. In fact, there's quite a few international studies, most of them in places like New Zealand and in England, Australia. So this is something that is of interest worldwide across a large group of children. So what have we learned from those studies? I can summarize it for you really in two simple bullets. The largest contribution of this work really is two things. One has been that we've been able to identify the resources that provide protection. So we've been able to, from a science standpoint, document those things that really do make a difference. Now I'm going to show you some slides of what those are and kind of give you a sense of which have more support than others. And you may find some in that list that fit with your own individual story of resilience. This process of longitudinal research has also allowed for modeling of how protection happens. So remember back to that two-part question, not only what is protective, but how does it do what it does? How does social support, for example, actually help kids to be resilient? So as we get into that, let me give you just one caveat so to bear in mind as you think about the protective factors. And I put on the slide potentially protective because you need to also remember that not all of these resources are protective for everyone, and that we always have to consider the risk factor or the stressor the child is experiencing. But understand that the resources that I'm going to talk about, these are the things that research has identified. They are the same whether you're at low risk or high risk, and that's some good news. It's good to know that they're not special order, unique characteristics that only benefit children in poverty. And in fact, they're the things that help kids at low risk as well. So let's take a look at some of those things. They're broken into three different categories. I'll start with the ones in the on the family list to the left. The research has supported three particular qualities of family life that appear to be protective for kids exposed to, again, these extraordinary kinds of risks. Things like your relationship with your parent. Probably not a terrible surprise that having a positive relationship with your parent makes a difference. The structure and organization of your family. So how organized, how rule-bound, how consistent, and how routinized the family is. And how many opportunities in the family you have for personal growth. How much your caregivers provide opportunities for you to be an individual and share your own unique talents and abilities. The second group are those fall broadly under the title of community protective factors or potential protective factors. And there's a couple of different ways we think about this. One that has research support is a relationship with a significant other. Having a main person in your life who really is behind you when things happen. Anecdotally, you can see this in various stories that people will tell. They'll have tremendous amounts of risk in their lives. They'll have these really terrible stories of extraordinary kinds of events. I would notice this, by the way, whenever I would watch interviews of sports figures. there seems to be a pattern when you interview sports figures and talk about their childhood. There's often a lot of hard luck stories about, having, lots of drug addiction in the family and having, 47 kids living in one house, and how did you make it through? And invariably, those stories end with, well, there was one person in my life. I couldn't let my grandma down, or that coach really mattered to me. And those anecdotal stories actually been borne out in research, that having just that one person who you really have a significant trust relationship with really can make a difference. In addition to the one person, we also know that a network is important. So having a social support network, a lot of people that you may not be very close with, but that reach out into a variety of domains for you is also supported by the evidence. And also children who participate in what are called pro-social activities, or environments where children get an opportunity to be appropriately social, interact with peers and with adults in ways that tends to boost their self-esteem and it provides them with more skills. The last group, skipped ahead. There we go. The last group are individual factors. And the ones towards the top of your slide are the ones with most of the research support. The ones at the bottom I'll talk about briefly. They are still in the running but don't have a lot of research support. Individual potential protective factors include things like intelligence level. And I wanted to break this out for you a little bit because it's not as simple as just being smart. There really is no evidence that the brighter you are, the more resilient you are. In fact, that would be a myth. There's plenty of psychopathology for those who are at the higher end of the intelligence scale. Really what we're talking about here are two abilities, problem-solving skills and planning ability. What we notice about kids who recover well from extraordinary conditions are that they tend to be very good at figuring out what needs to be done in order to recover. Sometimes this is done actively and sometimes this is just done internally. But they're very good at figuring out next steps. They're also very good at planning for the future and organizing their resources in a way that tends to benefit them. They're able to call on the right people at the right time, if you will. They know who to call on for whatever the need is, and they can plan it very well accordingly. Another place where we see lots of support is perception of control. And what I put on there was accurate perception of control. It's really important that children understand what's in their power and what is not in their power. That they're in charge of, maybe their G.I. Joe doll, but they're not in charge of the third grade, so that they have to understand where their choices lie and where their choices don't lie. And what we notice about kids who are resilient is that they typically are very spot on about this. They may not be able to tell you overtly, verbally tell you what they're in charge of and what they're not, but behaviorally we see this. They don't typically try to reach beyond their ability, and they surely don't try to engage in controlling circumstances or events or trying to affect change in circumstances where they don't have any control. So they don't waste their time, is a short way to say that. Another one is temperament. This one has probably the most amount of research. And as a clinician, this is the one that typically is the most frustrating for me because there's not a lot we can do as interventionists for temperament. But what we really mean is low emotionality, meaning that these are kids who stay fairly even keel emotionally. They don't get exceptionally happy about things, and they don't get exceptionally sad about things, meaning they just don't go to extremes. And so they're able to maintain a very reasonable amount of response to a situation, which allows them perhaps to do that good problem solving and good planning. One of the things we know is that if your brain is very, very active, if you're quite emotional, whether angry or sad, it reduces your ability to think rationally. And these are children who don't find themselves in that irrational place very often. The last three that are on the slide are ones that are continued to be recommended in the literature, but don't typically have lots of research support. So things like how self-confident you are, how motivated you are to do well, that may anecdotally seem like a protective factor, but it just, as it stands today, does not have as much research support. Being talented is often suggested as a possible protective factor, often because people who are talented will point to this as a part of the reason why they were able to make it. The fact that they could sing or that they could dance or that they could run really fast allowed them a pathway to college or allowed them a pathway to other supports. But talent alone is really not what we find in the research. And lastly, religious or spiritual belief is also has some support and is growing in its investigation. More and more researchers are looking into spiritual factors in the family as well as in the individual that might make a difference. So understanding those protective factors, let's see if we can try to answer the second part of the story, which is how they work together. So now we say resources or protective factors, and I'll use those interchangeably. How do those actually work? The list is nice, but when you're facing a child, how do they actually work together to affect positive outcomes for those kids? Let me give you an example to sort of show you how it's not as straightforward as we would all probably like it to be. Social support is one of those potentially protective factors that I talked about, and most people would probably not find it too challenging to understand why having support would make a difference. But let me show you what the research shows. That for kids exposed to serious adversity or environmental conditions that are overly challenging, social support operates this way. Kids who are resilient actually had a specific kind of support. They didn't just have a lot of friends or have a coach in their life. What they had was support that operated to increase their skills, decrease their exposure to more stress, and expose them to new experiences. So it's not simply a count of friends or how much you like someone or how much they like you or just the positiveness of your relationship. This point really helps us to see that there's some complexity here. The kind of support or how it functions really does make a difference. And what we do in order to try to make a picture of this is test models of these relations so that we can get a better sense of how they work. So what have we learned? And I'm going to show you a picture in just a second so you can see how it might all work together. What we do in modeling is we try to test the interactions between those resources, between those risk factors and protection. And what we've learned from those tests is the following. Probably one of the most important takeaways from the talk today is this notion. Resilience is not a destination. There are not resilient children and not resilient children. It really is a misnomer. It is really a process. Unfortunately, it's a marathon more than a simple trip. It is a process that children go through, and that at any given time, children may be in the recovery point or they may be in the challenge point. But that ultimately, we have to look at this as a long-term experience for children. Some children are able to maintain a better sense of functioning over a variety of events, but you cannot say that this child is resilient and this child isn't. You really do have to follow them over time to be sure. We have to look at the risk that the child experiences and what it does to their adjustment. We have to appreciate, for example, that risk varies in terms of severity and frequency and predictability. We also have to appreciate that risk impacts different places of children's lives, so that sometimes the risk that a child experiences is at school and sometimes it's at home, and we have to appreciate those differences. We also want to look at how those protective factors exert their protection, and in some of the models what we've been able to do is determine which ones are more relevant than others, which protective factors matter more than others, and whether there are age or gender differences in terms of what is protective. And our longitudinal studies really allow us to do that, allow us to examine both those direct and indirect effects. So let me start to show you some pictures so you can get a sense of what I mean by these models. Here you see a simple model of life events on one side leading to behavioral outcomes on the other, right? So you have stress events or traumatic events, and that relates to your behavioral outcome. And then you see resources or protective factors also exerting an impact. So resources also make your behavior positive or negative, and also impact how that will happen, right? So the arrow where you see it going down onto the life events and the behavioral outcomes. So resources tend to make the relationship between life events and outcomes greater or lesser. But that's not the whole picture. The other thing that we're learning is that resources have an impact on outcome, but also something called appraisal or interpretation. So things like perception of control or temperament or social support impact how a child interprets the life events that they experience. It changes how you think about those things. If you have lots of support, then typically you find that that children will interpret their life events as not so bad. But if you have very little support, or if your support doesn't provide you with great opportunities, then you'll typically interpret those life events as pretty negative. The next thing that we see in the process is context, that it matters where in your life that these events occur, and where in your life will also influence how you interpret the events you experience. So for kids who are great athletes, spraining their ankle is a much bigger deal, meaning they'll interpret or appraise that as a much bigger stressor than, say, having a fight with a friend. But if the most important thing in your life as a child is school, then getting a bad grade will be appraised as a much more negative thing than, say, spraining your ankle. Lastly, it matters how you cope. And what we know is that the resources like IQ or perceptions of control or social support impact how children cope. And that the more resources that you have, the more coping you're able to do. It essentially opens up a wider repertoire of coping options. So the more of those potentially protective factors that you have, the larger your closet is, if you will, of shirts or types of coping or types of pants you can put on, the kinds of things you can do. The smaller your resources, or the least, or how ineffective your resources are. So if you have social support that's not very good, that tends to make your closet smaller. So you have fewer options to choose for how you will cope with something. Ultimately, if we put all of that together, it looks like this. And I show you this not to confuse you or to make things more complex, but to really make the point that resilience is complicated, that it really is not a simple cause and effect, or just having a good relationship with your mom, even though that may be a part of how kids become resilient. What you see here in the overall model is that there's a couple things that happen that it helps to explain how it happens, so that you have a sufficient amount and quality of resources that influences how you think about things, and how you think about things ultimately influences your coping style. How you interpret things essentially influences your coping style, and your coping style then ultimately influences your outcomes. Wanted to give just a quick plug to a recent study that's going on that we're involved with here at KU, where we're looking at child maltreatment and looking at longitudinally how kids exposed to child abuse recover using the model that you just saw. So, in a nutshell, if your resources in the purple box are larger than the demands of the situation that you're experiencing, what we tend to find is kids tend to do better. You need for the demands of your situation to be smaller than the resources that you have available. And what that allows is for your appraisal or your interpretation of the situation to be accurate or effective, and for you to then develop or demonstrate effective coping. So it's a process. Some lessons learned from the field in closing. Don't worry, children are resilient. We want to try to avoid this notion. Although it's the case that children recover from day-to-day events all of the time, this sort of a notion suggests that it's some resourcefulness on the part of the child that makes them resilient, and not the myriad of environmental factors that go on. This is not a special child or a special quality of the child. It's not what we see. And in fact, any child has the potential to be resilient, or to demonstrate the resilience process, to be more accurate. Also, we need to be careful of magic bullet programs. Clearly, by just showing that snapshot of a picture of a model, you get the sense that it is a process and that it's a complicated one. It is not linear, and it's not a simple cause and effect. Finally, we have to be aware that there are preventable risks out there, and that to the degree to which that children experience trauma, we might also want to be focusing our efforts on stopping things before they actually occur. So we know that there's a tremendous risk associated with low birth weight children, for example, and we might want to be thinking about what we can do to be setting kids up for success from the very start. In terms of future directions, I saw that quite a few of you were early childhood focused, so that's actually a very hot area for work right now. Most of the work that I just presented is about school-age and adolescent youth. But there's really a lot of evidence that early childhood is where to focus our attention. There's something called the rebound effect that occurs if you allow enough time. Children essentially will have sufficient space to recover. As an example, one of those longitudinal studies I showed you in a previous slide, in Hawaii they followed kids who, from birth all the way till age 40, and they compared kids who were demonstrating resilience, or adults who were demonstrating resilience at 40 to those who were not. Both of those groups had the same amount and severity of risk. And what they found was that at age 40, that what made a difference, how those kids were able to demonstrate resilience, was everything that had happened before they were 10 years old. And in fact, most of what had happened to them by the time they were 3 or 4 or 5 years old. So what made a difference was the positive interactions they had had before they were 2, the number of supports they had had between the time they were 2 and 10, and the problem-solving skills they had before they were 10, and how healthy they were before they were 10. Everything else that happened after they were 10 had very little impact on how they were doing at age 40. It's also important to remember that biology plays a role here, and some of the emerging research is also focusing on brain function and neurochemical function in children to better understand how kids could be biologically predisposed to recover faster than some other children. Well, I know that's a lot of information, and so I just want to say thank you. There's a link there if you're interested in the SPARK project, our longitudinal project on maltreatment in youth. Also a website if you would like, our email address if you would like to email us, and my email address if you would like to email me.
Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Jackson. We really appreciate it. We have had a couple of questions that have come in, and so one of the questions is, are the protective factors true across cultures?
That's a great question, and that's also an area of research that's quite powerful these days. Folks are starting to look at how it varies if you look at, say, African American youth, or if you compare Hispanic youth. And what we're finding is that there are unique processes within those groups. There, for example, the list of individual protective factors, some of those protective factors, like spirituality, for example, have much more support. That literature has much more support in the African American youth community than, say, it does in the Asian youth community. So overall, we see the greatest support for some of those other factors, but if you look within cultures, some of those individual protective factors actually are much more powerful. So yes, it really does matter.
Great, thank you. Before I ask the next question, I just wanted to remind people that you can ask questions by typing into the question chat box on your GoToMeeting panel, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you so you can ask the question verbally, so we will be on the lookout for anyone raising their hand. The next question is, are there critical developmental stages at which resiliency is built?
Absolutely. And can I say that every developmental stage actually has its own unique, if you will, resiliency needs. If you're trying to build in resiliency or help children to recover faster, there will be age-specific things that will be different, right, for each age group. So, for example, in preschool age kids and early childhood, what we find in those environments is that, say for the parent relationship, so that's one of the protective factors in the family, is the relationship with the parent. The kinds of interactions that we would want parents to have with their 3-year-olds would be very different than what we want to have for a child we were trying to build in resilience for a 10-year-old. So, and a lot of the difference is really around developmental expectations. So what you would want to do with a 3-year-old is making sure that they are engaging socially, that they are communicating, that they have opportunities to get power and control over what's safe for a 3-year-old, that they are given lots of reassurance, but not necessarily a lot of verbal reassurance. Whereas with a 10-year-old, we might provide an opportunity for them to express themselves verbally. We might give them opportunities to draw. We might give them opportunities to act out or role play, where they could practice problem solving or practice that planning ability so that they may be able to implement it. That's where some of the new research, by the way, is also going, is trying to test in some pilot ways interventions based on some of these potential protective factors. Could we actually teach it, put it in a bottle, if you will, and pass it out? So all of that work, though, to your question, has been around developmental expectations for that child.
Great, thanks. The next question is specifically, what is the impact of low birth weight on resiliency?
Low birth weight sets children up for a host of developmental delays. So what we know is that children who experience low birth weight need a lot of physiological as well as behavioral care. It's like any child who has a developmental delay, but that is a clear and compelling risk factor for children to be behind. And remember, if you are behind from the beginning, as regular, typical, or expected life events come along, your ability to respond to what are expected challenges will be significantly delayed. So that's one of those easy to identify concerns that we want to make sure those children got a tremendous amount of support, because if you will, they're already set up to be a step behind. And you see that academically, you see it other ways. It just becomes more salient when that same child then experiences a hurricane, or their parents divorce, or is maltreated, right? Then the effects from that maltreatment or from that hurricane are simply magnified.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, we're going to go ahead and close out our webinar. Thanks again so much, Dr. Jackson, for the wonderful information today. We are going to just wrap up. I know that you had a couple of questions about where to access the PowerPoint presentation and how to get a certificate. And so I'm going to pull up some slides, and we will cover that. Okay, first of all, I just wanted to remind you that we have 2 more webinars this week. Tomorrow focuses on what early childhood professionals need to know about psychotropic medications, and then Friday is focused on compassion fatigue for those of us who work in emotionally demanding occupations. So I would urge you to register for both of those. If you haven't had a chance, I have seen both of the presenters, and it's really wonderful information. So it's not too late, so go ahead and sign up. And you can do that by going to the keccs.org website. You will receive a survey after the webinar, so please fill it out. The feedback is really important to us so we can plan our webinars accordingly. You can request a certificate of attendance by sending me an email to ckane@ku.edu. If you have any questions about anything, you can also email me. And so just keep in mind, if you need a certificate, you need to request it. And the PowerPoint presentations will be posted on the keccs.org website. So thank you very much for attending today. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the psychotropic medication webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.